Thank you very much. Thank you for the intro. It's great to be here, and I'm really pleased to be working and talking with people from the fishing industry, because too often as a scientist we talk about better engagement with stakeholders and all this sort of stuff, and very rarely do we get a chance to actually sit down and talk to folk. And the other confession I'll make is that I do like fish, and so sustainable fisheries are something I feel deeply about. That's one of my son's signature dishes there. I got interested in plastics about 10 years ago now. It's one of these topics which has been kicking around since, 1970s. People started talking about it, but it really didn't come into the mainstream till the last few years. Now everyone's talking about it, and sometimes with sense and sometimes with less than sense. So I thought I'd just quickly, yes, the mystery, thank you. Go through a few things. This is just skimming the surface on all these topics. Be very happy later on after the meeting to talk to people a bit more about this. So one is to point out marine litter, which is out there, is already having a direct impact on the fishing industry. I'm sure you know that. But fishing and aquaculture is also a source of litter. And in particular, the effect of derelict fishing gear, abandoned, lost, otherwise discarded fishing gear on the environment, on the ecosystem, but also, of course, it has implications for food security and for livelihoods as well. And finally, I want to just touch on the potential impacts of plastics on food safety, which is an issue which has been in the media quite recently, and is something which the FAO, for example, is quite concerned about. Now, this is a familiar figure, I guess. From the 1950s onwards, we've been using more and more plastics, and there's a reason for that. They're extremely useful materials. And in the fishing and aquaculture industry, of course, you've embraced them because of their properties, their longevity, and in packaging, in terms of food hygiene, food security, and so on and so forth. The problem is we've been very good at generating different types of polymers and using them, finding uses, but we've been very bad about dealing with them when we've finished using. So it's been a very linear industry of production, use, and disposal. And unfortunately for the planet, disposal often ends up in the environment, often ends up in the ocean, because that's where an awful lot of we dump ends up in the ocean. This is just the latest of a long line, and it's rather more visible than a lot of the things we use the ocean as a dump site for. Now, what is it? Well, it's anything and everything, but I'm focusing just on that plastic component, which makes up 60, 70, 80% of all the material out there. It comes in all shapes and sizes. Scientists, we like to sort of chop things up into groups, so we might describe something as mega size right down to nano size, so that's material which is very, very small, which starts having properties of nano materials, and everything in between. And there's just some examples of the sort of things that are commonly found in the environment, and some examples of living things alongside. Now, where does it all come from? Well, we have a long list of places where it comes from. A lot of it comes from land-based activities. You may often come across this figure, 80% of litter comes from land, and so we don't need to worry about the rest. Well, it's not true, and we don't really know the quantities for any of these categories, except we know in some places they're more important than others, and in some cases they're very substantial. Probably the single biggest source is from inadequate waste management, because most of the planet doesn't have it. Most of the planet does not have wastewater treatment. But there are some significant sea-based sources from shipping and from fisheries and aquaculture, recreational activities, and other general maritime activities. What else do we know? Well, we know it takes an awful long time to degrade in the environment. This is a little schematic which shows that if you have material from wherever it comes from, sitting on a nice sunny beach with wave activity, it will tend to fragment rather quickly into smaller and smaller pieces. It's still a plastic, it can still cause issues, but it's become smaller and smaller. As soon as that material gets in the seawater, as soon as it gets covered in biofilms, as soon as it gets below the surface, that rate of biodegradation gets lower and lower and lower. So by the time you've got something which is on the seabed in any more than a few tens of meters of water, it ain't going to do anything apart from sit there for an extremely long time. You may see figures it takes 100 years to degrade, whatever. They're just estimates. No one knows, because the plastics have only been around in industrial quantities for the last 50 years. But it's a long time, okay? This is just one little example, which I thought might amuse you. This was from a survey in Studland Bay down the south coast a few weeks ago. And they found a crisp packet, has a manufacturing date of 1958. For the youthful in the audience, below 40 years old, we changed our currency. We used to have pounds, shillings and pence until 1971. And so that's a 5 old pence. So, you know, it shows you. In other words, stuff sticks around. Even something as inconsequential as a crisp packet hangs around. Now, there has been a bit of work done on the costs, direct costs of the fishery sector. This is quite old now. This is done by John Muat back in 2010. Gives some estimates for the whole European fleet of direct costs of litter. So the biggest cost is from the additional time to sort the catch, but then it's removal of material from the fishing gear, damage to gear, damage to propellers, cost of rescue services. These are all things which can be quite easily quantifiable. And at that time, the total cost was estimated to be 62 million euros. So it's not an insubstantial cost, direct cost to the industry. The fishing sector has helped this, helped to reduce the problem. I think this is a brilliant scheme, Fishing for Litter. It was started, coordinated by Chemo International, a group of municipalities. I think it started in the Netherlands. If you can't read the little numbers, the top figure says there are, up to 2016, 300 Scottish fishing vessels. I can't read it either. 130 from England, I think mostly in the southwest of England. Then the Netherlands and Sweden's also involved. The bottom right figure shows the quantities caught. Clearly, the Dutch fishermen are much more effective at catching litter. Whether that's due to the type of gears which are being used, or whether that just reflects the quantities of material in the seas where they're fishing, I don't know. But I think this has been going for quite a few years, and I personally think it's an excellent example which should be spread out to more fishers. So if you don't know about this, you can go onto the Fishing for Litter site, but it's a way of encouraging fishermen to bring back any litter they find at sea, to land it on the dock without cost. So that's to encourage. Otherwise, if you're going to start paying for stuff you bring back, clearly that's a non-starter. Now, you may have seen a map like this, or heard something like this. This was a study published a few years ago, and it looked from the World Bank, looked at how we manage all our waste, which generally isn't very well. And the big yellow circles show how much plastic waste we generate, and you see Europe's extremely good at generating plastic waste, as is the United States. The yellow portion shows how much we mismanage. Well, in the case of Europe, it looks great, doesn't it? But, until very recently, for every 5 containers that arrived at Felixstowe, 3 would return back east with rubbish in, and 2 would be empty. Now, China's stopped that trade now, but instead that material is going to India and Vietnam and other countries which are ill-equipped to deal with it. So we kind of export our problems. So from this picture, it looks like everything's coming out of Southeast Asia, and it's not really our problem at all. You can do some more fancy modelling. You look at coastal populations, river flows, things like that, and you come up with this sort of estimate. So this is river discharge, and so the size of the blue circle indicates the quantities. And you see again Southeast Asia, some in West Africa, and the Amazon. It's not our problem. Unfortunately, that's one way of estimating what's coming off from poorly managed waste. It doesn't take account of something which is more difficult to quantify, which is all the stuff which is coming directly off the beaches and the stuff which is coming from sea-based sources. And if you're living in a wealthy country, you can put barriers up and so forth and stop it going in. But of course, in most countries, they can't do that. But we know there are wastes coming from the sea. Sometimes it's accidental losses from shipping. So these are a couple of pictures from the southwest. I'm sure if you're from the southwest, you'll be boringly familiar with walking on the beach and finding stuff being washed up, mostly from containers being washed overboard. But you also find a lot of fishing-related debris. This is from one of my local beaches. I come from Norfolk. I live in Norfolk, rather. But it's much more difficult to quantify that. This is an interesting survey. It was done for the Commission. Some beach surveys around Europe, different seas. This is from the southern North Sea, from Ostend. And you can see this is going along, finding what was on the shoreline and then attributing it to source. And you see about half the material there, just over half, was deemed to come from maritime sources, shipping, ports, fisheries. And of that, about 12% was from fisheries. Go to other parts of Europe, other parts of the world, you get different numbers. But it just illustrates in this particular region, it's a significant source. The other big source there, 30%, is from shoreline activities. That's people being messy on the beach, visiting the shore and not taking away their rubbish. Some of the biggest impacts we see in terms of wildlife impacts are actually from fishing-related gear. This is just, again, a fairly local example. The picture on the right-hand side shows a gannet colony down in the southern North Sea. And unfortunately, these gannets, they really like this orange fishing line. I can't remember what the name of the stuff is. It's what comes off the bottom of a bottom trawl when it gets dragged along. And they prefer it to seaweed. They normally should use seaweed to line their nest, but they use this stuff. And of course, they get it caught around themselves, and you get a lot of dead birds. It's not very nice. So that's a consequence of fishing practice, and perhaps it's avoidable, perhaps it isn't avoidable, but it's something one should be aware of and try and mitigate against, if possible. Now, there's another interesting study which looked at so we have, as we all know, we have a lot of derelict gear for lots of different reasons, accidental loss, and for various reasons. Now, there's a study done looking at a crab fishery, blue crab fishery in Chesapeake Bay, and they realised they were losing an awful lot of pots. And they wonder what the impact would be on the fishery, what impact was it actually having on the fish, on the crab stocks. So this fishery, they had a closed season where the fishermen usually didn't have anything to do, they became builders or whatever. They actually paid them to train them up to go and train them how to locate pots. They mapped out the hot spots and then had a targeted removal program. And they looked then at catches over the next few years. And in terms of the recovery and the increase in income, they had something like a 5 times return on investment. So for the money they got put in to launch this program, they had a much higher return. And what they then did was look at a whole series of crustacean fisheries around the world. So here they used the edible crab in this region. They applied a few assumptions. It's a model. The numbers aren't correct, but they're instructive. And they came up with these numbers, that if you look at the total landings from that from those fisheries. If you look at the average gear loss, if you were to recover 10% of those pots by targeted removal, then that's the sort of revenue you get back. Now, why this is relevant to plastics is, of course, a lot of these pots and other fishing gear is made of plastic, and so it doesn't rot once it's released into the sea. So this points to, one, gear recovery, but it also points to better gear design and also having features in the gear which do degrade in the environment. So this sort of thing doesn't go on. And there are some new polymers being developed which will allow you to do that, being tested in Korea. Now, the other thing you may have heard of is microplastics. People get quite exercised by this. What most people have come across are called microbeads. It's the sort of stuff you find in beauty products, facial scrubs, I use every day, toothpaste. It's also used industrially for scrubbing down ships' hulls. It's used in 3D printing. And that's the sort of stuff. It's primary microplastics manufactured for a purpose. Secondary microplastics are just bits of plastic, small bits of plastic which started life as something else, whether it was a tyre, whether it was whatever it was, some of that material on the beach which is broken down and fractured. The reason people are concerned about that is because plastic's a bit like a lipid. Like with oily fish, it's a great collector of nasties which you've already put out there, like dioxins or DDT or whatever. Plastic acts a bit like that. So anything that's in the water already can get into the plastic. It's a bit like a sponge. The other thing, though, is some nice PET bottles, I'm glad to see we don't have here, have very little in, right? But if you take something like PVC or anything used in construction, any durable plastics, they often have a lot of additives in to give it properties, whether it's colour, whether it's to stop UV degradation, whether it's flame retardants in your phones, can be up to 50%. And these things kind of leach out. They don't stick around. So once they're ingested, as they will be, because a lot of organisms, they don't distinguish what they're eating, get into the prey, into the predator, there's a chance of that material being ingested and potentially contaminating the product. And then the concern, which is a legitimate concern, is what happens in terms of human consumption. Does it have an impact on people? Now, of course, for a lot of the fish we were talking about today, you only eat the flesh. So it's only if anything crosses the gut boundary. Some things we eat the whole thing, like mussels. Other parts of the world, they do eat the whole organism. So it's different issues in different parts of the world. And so there's this question, legitimate question. Now, the FAO responded to that by setting up a working group. I was actually part of it. And their conclusion was, at the moment, if you looked at the quantities being eaten, we know if you go to Brussels to have your mussels and frites, you will consume microplastics, okay? That's we know that. But the question I always ask is, so what, right? Does it matter? And at the moment, the answer is no, to the best of our knowledge. In terms of the total or the additional amount of contaminant, chemical contaminant you're taking in, it's something like less than 0.1% of the total dietary intake, okay? It's assuming all the worst possible cases, very, very small. But the problem with this sort of thing is not so much what the scientific risk assessment says, it's the perception. My background was in radioactivity. I remember days when there were battles between Norway and Ireland and the UK government over the Sellafield discharges and techniques to getting into Norwegian lobsters and ruining the industry and so forth. It was political wars. I remember after Fukushima, when the concentrations had come way down and it was safe to eat, but no one was eating the fish, okay, because of fears and perceptions. So the thing with an issue like this is not to ignore it, but to recognise that there may be a concern about this particular issue, but then deal with it and then communicate what we know about it, which is at the moment, it really is not an issue. There are far more other things to worry about than that. So I think that's where I want to leave you. Just to quickly conclude, and I'm so very happy to talk more about this, 'cause it's a very, very big, complicated topic to cover in a few minutes. So what's in there at the moment, wherever it comes from, is imposing a cost on the industry. But the industry does need to recognise it's a source of material, a source of plastics, and that some of that is having an impact, not just on the environment, but on livelihoods, potentially on food security. But in terms of food safety, there is not an issue at the moment, but that is something that has to be communicated sensitively and sensibly to the consumer. Okay, thank you.